The gavel had already fallen. The verdict was already written. And yet, in the middle of the coldest, most silent courtroom in the county, a 9-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress climbed onto a wooden chair so the judge could see her over the railing, wiped her nose with the back of her hand, and said the words that would later be replayed on every news station in the state. "Free my daddy, and I will make you walk." The judge, a heavy-set man who had not smiled in that courtroom in 11 years, let out a short, disbelieving laugh. 2 lawyers exchanged glances and smirked. A bailiff near the door covered his mouth to hide his own grin. Somewhere in the gallery, someone actually applauded sarcastically, as if the girl had just told a joke at a comedy club rather than made a desperate plea for her father's freedom. Nobody in that room, not the clerk typing away at her keyboard, not the reporter scribbling in his notepad, not even the public defender standing beside the girl's father, believed for 1 second that anything the child said could possibly be true. But before this story reaches the moment that silenced every single one of them, we have to go back. We have to go back to a small house at the edge of cornfield, to a father who worked with his hands until they bled, and to a little girl who refused, against every possible odds, to believe that miracles were only for other people. If this story about a father's love and a daughter's unshakable faith is already touching something in you, do us a favor before you keep watching. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this video with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so you never miss another story like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Her name was Della Mae Whitfield, and everyone in Comfort Creek, a town so small it did not appear on most printed maps, knew her simply as the barefoot girl who talked to horses. She was born 3 weeks early on a January night, so cold that the pipes in the Whitfield house froze solid, and her father, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Samuel Whitfield, had to break the ice off the well with an axe just to get water for his wife. From the very beginning, it seemed like the world had decided the Whitfields would have to fight for everything they were given. Samuel worked the land of a wealthy cattleman named Bostwick Calloway, tending fences, breaking horses, and doing the kind of back-breaking labor that ruined men's spines by the time they turned 50. He was not paid well, but he was proud, and pride, in a town like Comfort Creek, was sometimes the only currency a poor man had left. Della's mother had passed when Della was only 4, taken by a sickness the local doctor never quite had a name for, and from that day forward it was just the 2 of them, a father and his daughter, living in a house with a roof that leaked in 3 places and a porch that groaned every time the wind picked up. But if you had walked past that little house on any given evening, you would not have seen sorrow. You would have seen Samuel Whitfield sitting on the steps after a 14-hour day, so tired his hands trembled around his coffee cup, listening with his whole chest to his daughter tell him about the shapes she saw in the clouds, or the names she had given to every stray dog in a 3-mile radius, or the plan she had to build a school for horses when she grew up, because in her mind, horses deserved an education too. Samuel never once let his exhaustion steal his attention from her. He would say, and this was something Della would repeat to herself for years afterward like a prayer, that a man could lose his money, his land, even his health, but the moment he stopped listening to his own child was the moment he had truly lost everything. Della adored him with the kind of fierce, uncomplicated love that only children seem capable of, a love that does not ask questions, does not calculate risk, and does not waver no matter what the world throws at it. The trouble began on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of gray, damp day that seems to swallow color out of everything it touches. Bostwick Calloway's prize stallion, an ill-tempered black horse worth more money than most people in Comfort Creek would see in a lifetime, was found dead in its stall, and the local sheriff, a man who had never liked Samuel Whitfield to begin with, decided almost instantly that Samuel was responsible. There had been an argument the week before, witnessed by 2 ranch hands, over unpaid wages Samuel was owed. Calloway had refused to pay him for a month of labor, claiming Samuel had damaged a fence during a storm, an accusation Samuel denied fiercely. Voices had been raised. Fists had, according to one exaggerated account, nearly been thrown. And so, when the stallion turned up dead of what the coroner eventually determined might have been a rare and sudden colic. The sheriff did not look for evidence of illness. He looked for a man he already believed was guilty, and he found one. Samuel was arrested on a chilly Wednesday morning while he was in the middle of feeding the chickens, and Della watched from the kitchen window as two deputies walked her father to a car with his hands cuffed behind his back, his flannel shirt still dusted with feed. She did not cry at first. She stood so still that the neighbor woman who had come to watch her, a kind but overwhelmed widow named Mrs. Aldrich, thought perhaps the shock had not yet reached her. But that night, when the house was dark and quiet in a way it had never been quiet before, Della cried into her pillow until her whole body ached. And then, sometime near midnight, she stopped. She sat up in the dark, wiped her face, and made a decision that a child her age should never have had to make. She decided she was going to save her father, whatever it took and however long it took, and she was not going to wait for anyone else to do it for her. The weeks that followed were a blur of courthouse hallways that smelled like old paper and floor polish, of a public defender named Mr. Grayson who meant well, but was buried under 40 other cases and simply did not have the hours in a day to fight for Samuel the way the situation demanded, and of a town that, disappointingly, had already made up its mind. People who had known Samuel for years, who had shaken his hand at church suppers and borrowed his tools without asking, suddenly crossed the street when they saw Della coming, as if guilt might be contagious. Mrs. Aldridge did what she could, taking Della in most nights, feeding her, brushing the tangles out her hair, but even she, in her most honest moments, admitted to the pastor that she feared the trial was not going to go Samuel's way. The evidence was circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence in a small town with a sheriff who had a grudge and a wealthy accuser with friends in high places could be just as damning as a signed confession. Della was allowed to visit her father twice a week, separated from him by a thick pane of scratched plexiglass and a telephone receiver that crackled every time either of them spoke. Those visits became the entire architecture of her week, the only hours that felt like they still had light in them. Samuel would press his palm flat against the glass, and Della would press hers against it from the other side, matching her small fingers to his, as if the glass itself could be willed into nothing through sheer stubbornness. He told her to keep going to school, to keep feeding the chickens, to keep being the kind of person her mother would have been proud of, and she told him every single time, without fail, that she was going to get him out. He would smile at that, a tired, aching smile, and tell her that hope was a fine thing to carry, but that she should not carry the whole weight of this on her small shoulders. She would simply shake her head and say that some weights were worth carrying. It was during one of these visits, only 3 days before the trial was set to begin, that Della overheard something that would change the entire shape of what was to come. She was sitting in the hallway outside the visitation room, waiting for Mrs. Aldridge to finish speaking with the court clerk, when 2 men in expensive coats walked past, deep in conversation, clearly assuming no one nearby was paying attention. One of them she recognized instantly, because his photograph occasionally appeared in the local paper. It was Bostwick Calloway himself. The other man she did not recognize, but he wore the kind of suit that told you he did not belong in Comfort Creek at all. Calloway was speaking in a low, irritated voice about how the whole situation had gotten more complicated than he intended, and how he needed this handled quietly before anyone started asking questions about the stallion's veterinary records from a month before it died. The other man told him to stay calm, that the sheriff was cooperative, and that a poor ranch hand's word would never outweigh Calloway's in this county anyway. Della did not fully understand every word of what she had heard, but she understood enough. She understood that there was something about the horse's health before it died that Calloway did not want anyone to see. She understood that grown men who were supposed to be fair and honest were instead working together to make sure her father never got a real chance. And in that hallway, sitting on a hard plastic chair with her feet not even reaching the floor, something shifted inside her. The fear that had been living in her chest for weeks did not disappear, but it was joined by something else, something sharper and more determined, a feeling that she was not simply a helpless child waiting for adults to decide her father's fate. She was in that moment the only person in Comfort Creek who knew the truth, and she made up her mind that she was going to find a way to make someone listen to her, even if it meant standing in front of a judge who would rather laugh at her than hear her. The 3 days before the trial passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold on no matter how tightly Della tried. She told Mrs. Aldridge what she had heard in the hallway, and the older woman, to her credit, did not dismiss it the way so many adults in Comfort Creek had dismissed everything else connected to Samuel Whitfield. She took Della to see Mr. Grayson, the overworked public defender, and sat with her hands folded in her lap while Della, in her small, steady voice, repeated every word she could remember about veterinary records and a stallion that may not have died of natural causes at all. Mr. Grayson listened, and for the first time in weeks, Della saw something flicker behind his tired eyes that looked almost like hope. He explained, gently, that a child's overheard conversation was not evidence a court could simply accept on its own, but that if there truly were veterinary records showing the horse had been sick before its death, and if Calloway had been hiding them, then finding those records could change everything. The problem was time. There were only 3 days left, and no judge in the world would grant a continuance based on the word of a 9-year-old standing in a courthouse hallway. Mr. Grayson filed an emergency request anyway, asking the court for permission to subpoena veterinary records from the clinic that served Calloway's ranch, and the request was denied within hours, the judge ruling that there was insufficient cause to delay proceedings. It seemed, once again, that every door was closing before Della could even reach it. But she did not stop. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper gone soft at the corners from being folded and unfolded so many times, and she wrote a letter. She was going to write to the veterinarian herself. She did not know his name, so she simply addressed the envelope to the animal doctor who takes care of Mr. Calloway's horses, care of the only veterinary clinic within 40 miles, and inside she wrote, in the careful, slightly crooked handwriting of a child who had only just learned cursive that year, that her daddy was innocent, and that she believed the veterinarian knew something that could prove it, and that she was asking, not as a lawyer or a judge, but as a little girl who had already lost her mother and could not bear to lose her father too, for him to tell the truth if he knew it. She did not know, and would not know for some time, that the letter reached a man named Dr. Elias Renner, a soft-spoken veterinarian in his 60s who had, in fact, examined the stallion 2 weeks before its death and diagnosed it with a severe intestinal condition that, left untreated, could prove fatal. He had recommended immediate treatment and warned Calloway explicitly that the horse's condition was serious. Calloway, unwilling to spend money on what he considered an overreaction, had ignored the recommendation entirely, and when the horse died, he had quietly asked Dr. Renner to keep the earlier visit out of any official inquiry, hinting that continued business between them depended on his discretion. Dr. Renner was not a wicked man, but he was a frightened one, dependent on Calloway's business to keep his small practice afloat in a struggling economy, and fear, as it so often does, had made him complicit in a silence that was destroying an innocent man's life. When Della's letter arrived at his clinic, arriving on the very morning before the trial was to begin, something in him finally broke open. He sat alone in his office for nearly an hour with the letter in his hands, and by the time he stood up, he had made a decision he knew could cost him everything he had built. The morning of the trial arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to match the mood of everyone walking into that small county courthouse. Della sat in the front row of the gallery in her one good dress, a faded yellow one that had belonged to her mother and been taken in at the seams by Mrs. Aldridge's careful hands, her feet swinging just above the floor because the bench was built for adults. Samuel sat at the defense table in a borrowed jacket, his shoulders squared in the way they always were, refusing to let anyone see him bend, even under the weight of everything stacked against him. The prosecution presented its case with a kind of lazy confidence, certain that the outcome had already been decided long before anyone stepped into that room. Witnesses spoke of the argument over wages. The sheriff testified with the smug certainty of a man who had never once questioned his own assumptions. Mr. Grayson did what he could, but without hard evidence, his cross-examinations landed like rain on stone, present but unable to change anything beneath. And then, just as the prosecution was preparing to rest its case, the courtroom doors opened, and Dr. Elias Renner walked in, carrying a folder under his arm. his coat still damp from the rain outside. Mr. Grayson, startled, requested a brief recess to speak with the man who had just entered, and after a hushed and hurried conversation in the hallway, he returned to the judge with a request to call an additional witness, explaining that new and directly relevant evidence had just come to light. The judge, visibly irritated by the disruption, allowed it only after the prosecution, confident there was nothing that could possibly hurt their case, raised no serious objection. Dr. Renner took the stand, and in a voice that shook only slightly, he told the truth. He described the visit 2 weeks before the stallion's death, the diagnosis, the warning he had given Calloway, and the request Calloway had made afterward to keep the visit quiet. He produced the folder, containing his own handwritten records from that examination, dated and signed, proof that the horse had been gravely ill long before Samuel Whitfield was ever accused of anything. The courtroom did not erupt into noise the way it might in a movie. Instead, it fell into a silence so complete that Della could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She watched Bostwick Calloway's face drain of color in the gallery. She watched the sheriff shift uncomfortably in his seat. She watched the judge, the same judge who had laughed at her only weeks before during a preliminary hearing when she had climbed onto a chair and made her desperate promise to make him walk if only he would free her father, lean forward with an expression that had transformed entirely from dismissive amusement into something closer to shame. The prosecution scrambled, but there was nothing left to scramble toward. Under further questioning, Dr. Renner admitted that Calloway had implied, more than once, that his silence would be rewarded and his cooperation with any investigation would end his business relationship with one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county. It became clear to everyone in that room that a poor man had very nearly gone to prison so a rich one could avoid an uncomfortable truth about his own negligence. The jury did not need long to deliberate. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict in a steady voice, and the word "not guilty" landed in that courtroom like the first real breath of air after being submerged underwater for far too long. Samuel Whitfield closed his eyes and lowered his head, his shoulders finally allowed to shake with the relief he had been holding back for weeks. Della was on her feet before anyone could stop her, running down the aisle in her mother's yellow dress. And when the bailiff moved to intercept her, the judge, in a small act of mercy that surprised the entire room, simply held up his hand and let her pass. She threw herself against her father, who dropped to his knees to catch her, and the two of them held each other in the middle of that courtroom, while people who had spent weeks looking away finally allowed themselves to watch, some of them wiping their own eyes without quite understanding why a stranger's reunion had moved them so deeply. It was the judge himself who approached them a few minutes later, once the room had begun to settle, once the reporters had stopped scribbling long enough to actually witness what was happening in front of them. He crouched down slightly, so he was closer to Della's height, and he said that he owed her an apology, that he had laughed at her words weeks before because he had never in all his years on the bench heard a child make such a bold promise in his courtroom, and that he had been wrong to laugh because it seemed she had, in her own way, made good on it. Della, still holding tightly to her father's hand, looked up at him and said simply that she never meant she could make him walk with her own 2 hands. She meant she would walk through every door that was closed to her, knock on every one that seemed locked, and keep walking until someone finally listened. And that was exactly what she had done. The judge did not laugh this time. He nodded, slowly, and told her that in all his years he had never been more grateful to be wrong about something. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that courtroom right alongside Della, please take just a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone in your life who still believes that love and courage can outlast even the darkest circumstances. And before we close this chapter, we would love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what part of Della's story touched you the most, or share a moment in your own life when someone small, or something small, ended up changing everything. Samuel Whitfield walked out of that courthouse a free man under a sky that had finally cleared of rain, his daughter's hand in his. And though the town of Comfort Creek would take its time fully making amends for the weeks it had spent looking the other way, it would never again underestimate the quiet, unshakable resolve of a barefoot girl who talked to horses, and who had once promised, standing on a chair so a judge could see her over the railing, that she would move heaven and earth for the only parent she had left.